Good morning. You'll just give us a moment for folks to load into the Zoom room. We will get started momentarily. Good morning, Happy New Year, and welcome to WITA's first event of 2023. We are excited to dive in with today's guests, but before we do, a few updates on what's been going on at WITA since we last saw you in 2022. We're deep into planning for our 2023 Washington International Trade Conference, which takes place February 13th and 14th. For those of you joining us from across the US and around the world, all the programming will be available via Zoom. And if you're local in Washington, D.C. or planning to travel here, you can watch the first day online and then join us in person for the final half day of events, including a networking luncheon. Then on March 3rd, we welcome back in person the 4 trade councils from the Congressional Trade Committees. That event will be streamed online and live in person, but it will not be recorded. So you have to watch it in real time to hear from the Congressional Trade Councils. This event has always been a highlight of the WITA calendar, and we hope you can join us either in person or online. Lastly, we've got big plans for the WITA Academy in the coming months, including a Job Pathways program at Howard University, an international intensive trade seminar focused on the European Union, and the return of our Trade on the Hill series. Information on all these initiatives can be found at www.wita.org. If you've watched any of our nearly 150 webinar panels since 2020, you know we like to call out the names of some of those you're in community with today, even if you can't see them on Zoom. So welcome today to Nancy Travis at Bio, Sierra Robinson at Citigroup, Susan Zimmerman at John Deere, and Mary Latimer at Mondelez International. Welcome Nancy, Sierra, Susan, Mary, and welcome to all of you. If you're watching this on Zoom, you can ask questions of our panel using the Q&A tab on Zoom. You should have also received a copy of today's event program and biographies of our speakers by email a few minutes ago, so we can dispense with lengthy introductions. It's a true pleasure to welcome today's guests, who probably don't need much of an introduction because you're probably reading their articles or those of their colleagues every day. Bryce Baschuk, a reporter with Bloomberg News based in Geneva, David Lynch, the global economics correspondent at the Washington Post, and Anna Swanson, trade and international economics reporter at the New York Times. Welcome, Bryce, David, and Anna. And welcome to our moderator, John Miller, chief economic analyst at Trade Data Monitor, whose firm is one of the world's top suppliers of trade statistics to governments, corporations, and many organizations across the globe. Thank you all for joining us today to walk through the most important geopolitical, economic, and trade trends of 2023. John?
Thanks, Ken, and thanks to WITA for hosting this event. Very excited to talk about 3 of the best trade and economics journalists in the world about some of the most important trends of 2023. At Trade Data Monitor, we're obsessed with numbers, and one thing we're seeing is the end of this COVID consumption boom and the decline of Chinese exports, which were down 10% in December and 19% to the US in December. And if you look at the last 50 years, the rise of Chinese exports and China joining the World Trade Organization, arguably one of the most important geopolitical events of the century. And I feel like we're at this geopolitical pivot point, and for all kinds of reasons, that U.S. China trade relationship is the most important one in the world. China is the world's biggest exporter by a lot. The U.S. is still the world's biggest importer, giving it enormous leverage in negotiations and making it just fundamental for any business relationship. Any big company has to take the U.S. market really seriously and U.S. trade terms really seriously. So the first big topic really is U.S. China. That's the dominant news story of the year. And I'm going to ask each of our panelists to reflect on what they see happening this year in the U.S. China trade relationship and supply chains and semiconductor politics, and how these negotiations and business realities will play out this year. And I'd like to start with David. David, what are your thoughts on 2023 and U.S. China trade relations?
Thanks, John, and thanks for having me as part of the group today. Yeah, I agree. This is kind of a really interesting moment in U.S. China trade terms and in globalization writ large terms. And I expect one of my major areas of focus this year is going to be on what I think of as sort of a rethinking of the terms of engagement with China. The mood in Washington now on a bipartisan basis is really thoroughly distrustful and antagonistic towards China. I should say the feelings probably mutual from Beijing. And what's been interesting to me is that, if you were somebody who went through the Trump years and thought, well, that was sort of an aberration, Joe Biden will come in and the world will snap back to what it was like before 2016, you've been disappointed because the Biden administration has not only kept in place Trump's 301 tariffs, of course, but has taken some even more aggressive steps. The ban on advanced semiconductor equipment from last fall, that's got all sorts of implications, which I'm sure we're going to talk about today. And, since the G20 in November, there's been this sign of sort of a tactical thaw in the relationship. I think both sides probably felt like, things were deteriorating in a really unpleasant and potentially destabilizing way. And so they've put a floor under that. You're going to see more engagement going forward. Secretary of State Blinken's going February 5th, I think. Janet Yellen has said she's going to go. Catherine Tai, I think, has mentioned plans for engagement. But the fundamentals of this relationship have not improved. And there's, for all the talk from both sides, and the president has been explicit about this, that we don't see complete decoupling. We don't think there's a new Cold War. If you look at the actions that both sides are taking, there's at least partial decoupling underway, and figuring out the terms of exactly how far to go in each area, I think, is one of the big stories for the rest of this year.
Thanks, David. And we'll talk a little bit later about how the free trade consensus is effectively over and what that means for the rest of the world. Anna, you wrote this week about the impact of subsidies and tax breaks in the realm of climate change. But for U.S. China, what do you see as kind of the bigger issue, and how will those subsidies questions play into that?
Well, thank you so much for having me. This is such a great forum, and I always feel a bit self-conscious speaking to this audience because there are so many real experts on trade here. So if anyone wants to contact me and correct me afterwards, I'm always open to that. Feel free to get in touch. But, I'm very interested in the U.S. China relationship. Earlier in my career, I lived in China for a long time, for 8 years. As I know, David spent some time there as well. And it's proved really useful in trade coverage. And I think, this moment is really interesting because we've heard a lot of conversation about decoupling with China in Washington for a long time. But I feel like this year we're starting to see the first hard evidence of that with the semiconductor restrictions. And particularly CHIPS had a provision that prevented U.S. companies from making investments in more advanced manufacturing in China if they do want to take the CHIPS funding. I feel like this is a really pivotal moment in finally forcing companies to decide where are you going to put your manufacturing, to make a choice between China and the United States and not try to awkwardly bridge this gap as the two countries just move farther and farther apart. And I think David is right that sympathy toward China in the United States, in Washington in particular, has just totally evaporated right now, even toward more basic economic cooperation. Blinken is obviously making a trip to China soon, and U.S. China engagement right now really seems more like keeping a floor under the relationship, keeping ties somewhat stable, rather than making any kind of real economic progress or cooperation. And I think there is a real threat looming with a conflict over Taiwan, which would obviously imply a lot of disruption to the economic relationship as well. What does that mean for companies and for their supply chains is a really interesting question for me this year. We have seen some sorting out, obviously, companies trying to diversify their supply chains, find new sources of supply. One thing that I feel is getting a little bit lost in the conversation is that there's still a lot of path dependency in the economic relationship, and that it's actually been quite hard for companies to exit China, for some companies to find alternatives to China. And often that's just a question of scale. China is just mind-bogglingly bigger, right? And so companies are trying to find new opportunities elsewhere. They are finding those opportunities, but it leads to other issues, problems with inflation, as companies try to sort out those supply chains. So I think that will be really fascinating to watch this year. And then you asked about subsidies as well. Obviously, that's a big source of contention. It's interesting that both the United States and Europe seem to have kind of thrown their hands up to some extent when it comes to Chinese subsidies practices. And now the US and Europe are more focused on this conversation with each other. I saw some comments on Twitter this morning asking, why isn't the EU as concerned about Chinese subsidization practices as it is about US subsidies in the Inflation Reduction Act? I think that's, an apt question, although it seems like probably the EU feels, that the United States is more of a close ally. So you can understand why they would be more concerned about that kind of behavior in an ally, whereas they would come to expect subsidization from China. But those are just a few opening thoughts. I look forward to our conversation today.
Thanks, Anna. Bryce is joining us from Geneva. Kind of a twist on the question. So when you look at U.S. China and compare it to EU China, which Anna mentioned briefly, what do you think are the differences in how the European Union is looking at China and its evolution economically, and how the U.S. is?
Thanks for having me on. It's really a pleasure to be with y'all. To answer your question, the U.S. and the EU clearly have, differing policies towards China at this point. I think there are areas where they're trying to work together. Probably a good example of that would be the green steel and aluminum negotiations that are ongoing. What we've seen from this administration in the United States is as David earlier mentioned, the hawks really in Washington are running the show. So far, you've seen this administration's approach as running faster by offering subsidies to encourage companies to reshore, to basically come back from China and go to maybe some Southeast Asian nations as well. You're also seeing the other aspect of this administration's policy is to slow China, and that's in the form of kind of the export restrictions that you've seen, chips and the goods and the tools made that make chips. So Europe is kind of playing a little catch up on that. I think the Inflation Reduction Act, which to put it crudely, it's kind of the United States realized that if you can't beat them, let's join them. Let's start subsidizing the way that China does. And I think the EU is having a little bit of trouble with that. This really is seen very discriminatory over there and or over here in Europe. And there's an approach to kind of soften that. And I think we'll see in the months to come, the United States and EU working together on that.
Thanks, Bryce. Please write your questions in the Q&A if you have any, and I will pass them along. But we want this conversation to be informal and be kind of chatty, as if you were talking trade at your local bar. David, I have a question. This is from a reader or a listener. How important do you think the new House Select Committee on China will be and will have an impact?
Well, first, I think if I started talking trade at my local bar, I'd get thrown out, but that's a secondary point. I think this House Select Committee, first of all, is very important and is very interesting. This was one of Kevin McCarthy's first official acts after enduring what he had to endure to become Speaker. So this has got top level support from the Speaker's office down. Both McCarthy and Mike Gallagher, who's, I think, a rising star in the Republican Party, a very serious guy, Princeton grad, doctorate from Georgetown in international relations, spent time in the Marines, very let's just say he has no illusions about the intentions of the Chinese government. And he's got a very extensive agenda. They plan to scrutinize just about every aspect of the U.S. relationship with China. They're going to look at TikTok. They're going to look at the purchases of farmland by Chinese companies, some of which have been, at least to some policymakers, worrisome because they're close to some American military bases, notably up in North Dakota. There's going to be a look at Taiwan, human rights. So I think this is going to be sort of a soup to nuts examination of the U.S. approach to China, and also a look back at how we got here. And, where were the mistakes in the thinking? Was it a mistake? Because if you go back to sort of the initial years after the end of the Cold War, there was a sense quite explicitly that by engaging both with post-Soviet Russia and with the Chinese, that by bringing them into the world trading system, that would encourage not only further economic liberalization, but further political liberalization. And of course, fast forward 25 years to where we are now, it's quite clear that that has not panned out. Now, does that mean it was a mistake to let China into the WTO? I think most people would say, no, there wasn't really much of an alternative. Maybe the error was in how it was executed or prosecuted, particularly in the early years when the U.S. perhaps could have done more through safeguard measures right out of the gate. But Gallagher is going to want to look back and say, how did we get here? And then also, where do we go from here? Which I think is the whole point of the select committee.
Thanks, David. And undermining this, obviously, is the politics and the fact that the free trade consensus is essentially over. I live in Pittsburgh, Pennsylvania, where 20 years ago, you might have heard a lot of intellectual arguments for free trade. Now that's no longer the case. And one thing it's clear that Trump politically got right and that everybody has followed him on is to sort of do away with this idea that free trade is this universal good that can help Americans in a broad way. Anna, in terms of trade policy, how do you see the repercussions of this sort of more protectionist mindset of the American people sort of filtering into think tanks and to the way that politicians think about trade? Is there sort of a new post-free trade consensus that is maybe more nuanced than just all trade is bad?
Yeah, definitely. It's a great question. Just really quickly, I can just comment on the China committee as well, because that'll be something I'm following this year as well. I do think, it's going to be more sort of hearings rather than legislation coming out of the committee, right? So a lot of naming and shaming of people who have connections with China. And I think it'll be really interesting, though, to watch the Republicans kind of build more of a political narrative around China and trade. A couple of things that I'm watching out of that are, what they say about investment restrictions, which are, a big looming potential policy with regard to China that we could talk more about. And then also, I think it's really interesting, the growing Republican opposition to ESG investing, environmental social governance investing, and what they say around that as well. But it goes along with this kind of more critical approach in the Republican Party to corporate America. And so I think that'll be really interesting to watch. And getting to your question about Trump doing away with the idea of free trade, whether there's a new post-free trade consensus in Washington, I absolutely agree with that. I think that's just become more and more clear over the past year. When Biden came into office, I think there was a lot of uncertainty, at least on my part, about what the direction of his trade policy would be, because he doesn't seem to have a very strong opinion on trade itself per se. On one hand, he is really an internationalist, but on the other hand, he's very close to labor unions and clearly cares a lot about their orientation. And I think you've seen those kinds of inclinations at tension in his trade policy, but you really have seen the interests of trade unions and kind of more progressive Democrats win out when it comes to trade. And similarly, I had kind of the same questions about Catherine Tai and her orientation at first, because she has this background at the WTO, but she also has, a really strong background in Congress. And I think it's become clearer and clearer that she also is thinking much more of the progressive wing in the United States, of the concerns of labor unions. When the Biden administration said they were going to focus on worker-centered trade policy, they really meant that, even if sometimes that means, to critics not necessarily doing trade policy at all. But I absolutely think that we have seen this clear post-free trade consensus forming in Washington, and that there are really a lot more similarities in the approach of the Biden and the Trump administration on many policies than there are differences.
Great point. Thanks, Anna. Bryce, how does the protectionist politics sort of thing look to you from Europe? I mean, Europe's had Brexit, obviously, and there's been the ripples of this. There's no sort of single, obviously, Trump figure, but do you see the EU becoming a lot more protectionist this year and the years to come?
There's certainly been a focus at the Commission in terms of strengthening their trade defense instruments. They're bringing more cases to the WTO. They're engaging bilaterally. But more broadly, there's been a lot of soul searching here in Geneva. I mean, the idea that China joining the WTO raised 1 billion people out of poverty is, that's an impressive feat, and that's something not to be forgotten. Nevertheless, the main architect of the post-war structure for international trade, the United States, is now coming at the WTO and saying it's on thin ice. These rulings against steel and aluminum, weigh on American sovereignty. And, that's caused a real chill here, at least in Europe, where, people are worried about where the structures that have held up global trade for the past, 75 years, whether they can persist. It's really remains an open question.
Thanks, Bryce. Open question for anybody who wants to take it. A question from a reader. Are there any kind of blue sky approaches to trade? For example, Costa Rica joining USMCA, or the UK negotiating trade deals with, Connecticut or West Virginia, individual US states. They can kind of offer solutions to this more kind of cramped protectionist mindset. Anything that's like it seems a little nuts now, but might actually work down the road.
I would, I don't know if this qualifies as blue sky, but I think, what you're unlikely to see are any of the sort of big global rounds that we haven't seen, frankly, in some time, and then the last attempts collapsed in failure. So you might see more so-called plurilateral attempts where, you get a group of countries together who share similar values and objectives and willingness or ambition to move. And you could see those kind of agreements, but I don't think anybody's going to be doing free trade agreements with Connecticut or West Virginia.
When I was covering the Doha round for the the Wall Street Journal, I noted that business support was basically the reason given for one of the big reasons for the end of free trade deals, that without business behind it, these deals don't get made. Sort of in that vein, a question from a listener: what should we expect from Congress in terms of outbound investment screening? Kind of related to the first topic. Anna, do you want to take that one?
Sure. Yeah. So I think there is, a lot of this is TBD. It's kind of unfolding right now. But it's clear that the administration is considering something, has drafted something. The details of it are a little bit unclear still, but, it seems, likely that it might be more of kind of a notification regime with then some restrictions around investing in certain sectors that are seen as national security risks. And the question, I think, then is when the administration does finally roll out investment provisions, is that, something that mollifies Congress, or is that something that provokes Congress, especially Republican members of Congress, to come back with investment restrictions of their own, saying that, the Biden administration has fallen short of this task? And I suspect, given the political environment, it would be the latter at the moment. It does seem like there is a lot of consensus and support building in Congress for investment restrictions in general. One point that probably people in the audience realize, but I think is quite interesting, and I apologize, my editor is like pinging me on Slack in the background. I'm going to ignore them. One thing I think is quite interesting is that at this point, the United States has set up strict restrictions on China when it comes to technology. But people see, investment and capital markets as kind of a big hole in that system. If we forbid U.S. companies from sending technology to China, but we continue to send money to China for China to build its own version of alternate technologies, you can see how that's a big loophole in our approach, and something that could be very negative to the interests of U.S. industry. So that view is, I think, becoming a lot more prevalent. Of course, you also have a lot of financial interests that want to keep investment ties with China open, legitimate interests as well. So there's also that force pushing back in the other direction. But I do feel that this will come to a head this year, and that we'll likely see some sort of restrictions in this area.
Thanks, Anna. A question from a listener for David. This is very interesting to me. Who are the pro-free trade constituents in the U.S.? This listener points out that China has a huge market for food and ag exports, tens of billions of dollars. Are there rural, senators sort of carrying the free trade torch left in Washington? Who are like the real pro-free traders in D.C.?
Yeah, I mean, there are, of course, advocates for it, and farm state senators are a good place to begin. You are seeing somebody, like Pat Toomey, who is a strong voice on free trade, and Rob Portman. They're stepping down, or have stepped down, I should say. And the recasting of the Republican Party in a more populist direction, I think, has had some effect on that debate. The problem, as always with trade, is that the benefits, as the old saying goes, tend to be diffuse and spread across the whole economy. I benefit from trade every time I buy something that's cheaper than it otherwise would be, because supply chains have been optimized, and the costs are felt more locally and more personally, and people tend not to experience the economy on a net national basis. They tend to experience the economy that's in their living room, and that's always been the problem for trade. And I think that's why after 20 years of building popular or populist resentment over this, you take a snapshot of where the Biden administration is on trade, and then take a look at where the Trump or the Obama administration was, and it's quite different. Two Democratic administrations. The Obama-Biden team was there, and it's a completely different approach, because I think it eventually just became politically unsustainable, to the point where USTR was the cockpit for Trump administration policy, not just towards China, but toward international economics in general. And whatever's going on at USTR today, it is certainly not the center of power in the Biden administration.
Really good point. Bryce, regarding WTO, I mean, this is a institution the U.S. championed for decades, now seems to be turning its back on. How is that perceived? There was a big ruling in December. Is there still hope for legitimacy among senior WTO officials. What's the future of the WTO, you think, this year and this decade?
It's going to be a real slog. I think, after the Trump administration, which was very clear about a lot of its animosity to the WTO and how it's kind of undermined American manufacturing and gutting, jobs. The Biden administration, there was hope there would be kind of a more positive tone. Certainly, Ambassador Tai came to Geneva early on and said, look, we believe in the WTO and we want to fix it. We're, halfway through the first part of the Biden administration's first term, and the conversations are kind of just going around in a circle right now. There was a lot of hope, particularly on the EU side, that there would be a reform of the dispute settlement rules, and a key part of that would be restoring or reconfiguring the appellate body, which has been paralyzed since 2019. Well, that conversation, which is still ongoing in Geneva, really hasn't gone too far at this point. It's there's a lot of talking about what the U.S. doesn't like about the system, but no real kind of substantive discussion of how to fix it yet. I think there's probably some folks here who wonder if the administration is stringing everybody along, whether it's just kind of satisfied with opting out of the WTO dispute settlement system, which may very well be the case. Certainly, we've seen a lot of appeals, and I expect another one probably tomorrow when related to that 232 steel and aluminum dispute. I'd say generally the mood is pretty gloomy here.
Thanks, Bryce. One of the most important trends in global trade, and we're seeing it a lot in the trade data, is diversification of supply chains. And one thing that we noted during COVID was supply chains basically held up, and the global logistics industry, trillions of dollars of muscle, was able to deliver packages from anywhere to anywhere, basically, and the system worked. This is also enabling manufacturers to shift production to countries like Vietnam and Malaysia. Question for Anna, then David. What's the perception in DC and from companies about Chinese manufacturers essentially relocating, and you basically have a rerouting of supply chains through these countries, some transshipment, some essential laundering of country of origin. Is there a concern that's sort of cheating the system, and you put tariffs on Chinese imports and then it just gets made in Vietnam from a Chinese manufacturer?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I do think it's really interesting to watch, and obviously there has been an important impetus to reroute some supply chains. I think for a lot of companies, this has looked more like diversification rather than just pulling out of China entirely, from what I can tell, from the data and from what people are saying, this kind of China plus one model rather than leaving China entirely. Again, because of some of the, capacity constraints that I talked about earlier, and also just, the huge China market, China's, continued kind of exceptionalism when it comes to manufacturing. So I think that has been really interesting to watch. And I've been following really closely the new restrictions on forced labor, the Uyghur Forced Labor Prevention Act, also the withhold release orders that have gone in on various products. And the potential for some of those measures is really sweeping, I think, when it comes, if the U.S. government were to fully enforce those restrictions on importing anything with ties to Xinjiang. Right now, they're really just enforcing part of it for some priority sectors, mostly from what I can see. But already that's kind of proven to be a nightmare for the solar sector, for some green energy sectors. We've heard a lot of reports about imports getting stalled, about new projects not being undertaken, because companies just, are not able to find these new sources of supply outside of China. And the solar tariff case recently was also really interesting to watch. This case about whether solar products were being circumvented or being, brought from China into Southeast Asian countries and then kind of minimally transformed before being brought into the United States. Obviously the Commerce Department did find that about, circumvention in about half of those cases, but not in the others. So, it shows that it's not a complete picture either way. Some companies have been able to substantially move those supply chains out of China. Other companies just in the solar sector are just kind of moving goods through these other countries into the United States. So it looks to me like it's something that's really in process at the moment right now. Companies, still very much tied to China, but starting to move out, and that process is still kind of incomplete.
Thanks, Anna. And David, your perspective. And also, is the U.S. Enforcement system sophisticated enough to kind of track all this stuff also?
Well, I think it is important to be clear on what's happening and what's not happening. And as Anna suggests, there's no, despite some loose talk that you sometimes hear from politicians, there is no wholesale exodus from China. That market is still simply too consequential for most companies to pull out and go elsewhere. And the logistics infrastructure that China boasts between the ports and the rails and the highways and the availability of labor, no other country can match that. There are aspirants who are trying. India in particular, I think, is trying to be the next China. But I have to say I'm skeptical of that, given some of the sort of chronic and habitual inefficiencies of the Indian bureaucracy and shortcomings of their logistics base. But one of the things that I'm interested in, and I haven't had a chance to do any reporting on this other than very anecdotal, is I am interested in sort of tracking some of the spread of these plus one. In other words, the marginal investment. You're not moving your plant, but if you're going to expand your capacity rather than double down in China, maybe you'll go to Vietnam, maybe you'll go to Indonesia. And a lot of the infrastructure that's being built in those countries to accommodate that sort of migration, I've been told, and I suspect, is being done by Chinese contractors. So I think that would be an interesting thing to know more about.
Thanks, David. One of the biggest trends in world trade this year and last year was the rerouting of Russian gas and oil from Europe to India, China, Turkey, other countries, and subsequent exporting of U.S. gas, LNG, from the fracking wells of Pennsylvania, where I live, and Texas to France, especially, and the rest of Europe, precipitated by the war, by Russia's invasion of Ukraine. Bryce, from your perspective, you're the closest. How do you see the war in Russia, and obviously given the embargoes in place, and assuming that the war is not going to end this year, what's next as far as enforcement or sanctions against Russia and other trends, subsequent to the war?
Yeah. I don't have a crystal ball in terms of when and if the war will end. But in terms of sanctions, the EU is preparing, I believe, their 10th package of sanctions, and it's been, really incredible to see how Europe and the United States have been able to really align on this issue of penalizing economically Russia for its invasion. I think you'll continue to see that in the year, this year to come. That's one, bright spot in the transatlantic relationship, is that there's no daylight between, how Brussels and Washington want to counter the threat from Russia, at least on economic terms. So I think we'll continue to see more of that.
Thanks, Bryce. A couple of listeners have asked about a geopolitical crisis with China. Obviously, the most extreme manifestation of that would be some kind of conflict with involving Taiwan, but there could be other crises too that involve incidents or a ship shoots a rocket somehow, or there's some kind of other big geopolitical crisis. If that happens, what are the kinds of safety we talked about? The U.S. has talked about stockpiling rare earths, other sort of ways of strategically getting ready for that. What are things that, if that happens, what should we be mindful of or expecting from the Biden administration and DC in terms of trade and trade policy? Because this is a really important question. David, you want to take that?
Yeah, it is. It's an excellent question. As a matter of fact, I'm not sure I have an excellent answer for it. First, I would say that kind of black swan is exactly the sort of thing folks should worry about, because the relations are so fraught, and the incentives on both sides. In neither capital is it a good time now to be seen as soft on the other country, or even thoughtful about the other country. The incentives are all to show how tough you can be. Uh, First of all, second, I have to say, just parenthetically, I personally don't think a near-term Taiwan crisis is a deliberate Taiwan crisis is all that likely. I think Xi Jinping has got his hands full at home with his economic problems and with dealing with the consequences, from his perspective, the unintended consequences of his increasingly authoritarian rule. So I think he's got plenty to worry about at home. I don't know whether we have adequate inventories of materials like the rare earth substances. I suspect we probably don't. I know, to go back to one of your earlier questions about Mike Gallagher's committee, I know he's been or is attentive to the need to stockpile some of the materials that are used to produce munitions for the U.S. military. And so if we don't have enough of that, I suspect we probably don't have enough of a lot of other things.
Thanks, David.
I can jump
Anna,
in.
do you want? Go ahead.
Yeah, sure. So yeah, I do think there's, an increasing awareness that the kind of, dependency that the United States has on China for like green energy products like solar panels and wind turbines is increasingly playing out in the electric vehicle sector as well, and so many other sectors like pharma, a lot of critical sectors. And obviously the Biden administration is really focused on that. I do think, they're trying to make this picture better through domestic investment and friendshoring, but, their ability to do so is really very limited, I think. If you look at critical minerals, for example, China is processing the vast majority of critical minerals, sometimes 100% of products. For one type of graphite, it's 100%. I know the administration is also really concerned about our growing dependence on China when it comes to legacy chips. We have a lot of restrictions right now on China's production of advanced chips and their ability to access technology for that. But we don't really have many restrictions on legacy chips. And the feeling is that, that China is going to increasingly grow its share of that global market. And so, I just think that is going to be an ever-present kind of issue that there's really no quick fix for our reliance on China in some of these critical sectors.
Thanks, Anna. And to follow up, you wrote an excellent piece this week about climate change and trade policy. What kind of conflicts do you see around energy or green energy requirements, mandates, and other sort of government enforcement actions that lead to kind of distorted behavior by companies? What kind of conflicts and friction will those cause?
Can you tell me what do you mean exactly by what are you getting at with the kind of conflicts? Are you talking about some of the measures that I wrote about in that piece, or
so the U.S. subsidizes a windmill manufacturer that violates anti-subsidy rules in other countries, for example?
Well, so I did do a piece this week about efforts at combating climate change, and I wanted to tie together some big policies that we've seen progress in recent months. Obviously, the Inflation Reduction Act has been a big area of contention, but also the European Carbon Border Adjustment Mechanism has been moving forward. And then Bryce mentioned this Green Steel deal, Green Steel Club that the United States has proposed that I've been really interested in. And that's something that the USTR has just previewed at this point, but that would be the United States and the EU initially banding together and putting tariffs on steel and aluminum from countries that produce them with more carbon emissions, which initially looks like it would mean all countries. So a lot to be fleshed out there, but it does seem like these environmental policies are really moving along very quickly, and we're just at the very beginning of these policies. And so I think it'll be really interesting to see how these come into tension with the kind of status quo trade rules and with the World Trade Organization, because obviously there are a lot of proponents of these measures that say that we need to act really quickly if we are going to have any effect on mitigating climate change. And, we can't really afford to worry about what the bureaucrats in Geneva might think about that. But other people say that this is very destabilizing to the global trading system, and that this will lead to a kind of general breakdown of order that the United States has worked really hard to establish over the past few decades. And again, I just think we're just at the very beginning of this process. These policies are just being formulated. The United States and the European Union are just figuring out how they're going to put a price on carbon emissions in some goods, starting with a few sectors, and there are many, many sectors left to go. So I just wanted to write that piece to kind of flag this as a big potential issue for trade fights in the years to come.
Thanks, Anna. Bryce, in Geneva, I'm sure there's a lot of talk about climate and climate change policies. Is there any kind of thinking about a new set of rules that would kind of exempt climate change goods? What's the chatter there?
Right. So, I mean, we're, like Anna said, we're still in the early stages here. The Inflation Reduction Act was a huge wake-up call, particularly for the European Union and other allies like South Korea and Japan. I think you're mentioning like a trade conflict. There's recourse to this, but it takes years. It takes a lot of time. This whole act is all about generating manufacturing in the United States. But once you produce all these, green climate technologies, ultimately you're going to have to export them somewhere. And if Europe decides that, look, these products are heavily subsidized, they're being dumped on our market, and they're hurting our producers, they have recourse to countervailing duties to raise the price on American exports of climate goods, or they could file a dispute at the WTO. Now, at Davos last week, it was pretty fascinating to hear the Director General of the WTO, Ngozi Okonjo-Iweala, say, look, we would prefer if the US and EU would settle this amongst themselves and not bring a dispute to the WTO. That's politically savvy because basically the US has been vetoing all disputes against it. And ultimately, I think this conflict or this disagreement will have to be resolved bilaterally.
Thanks, Bryce. David, question for you from a listener. The Indo-Pacific Economic Framework, can you briefly summarize what it is? And then will it have an impact? Is that kind of a PR move, basically, or is it something that's substantive?
Well, I think the administration regards it as substantive. There's certainly been, there's been interest from some of our Asian region, Southeast Asian, Pacific region partners in doing something. But I think in a nutshell, the general reaction has been, this is nice, but it doesn't do anything for those countries in terms of market access in the US, which is the big carrot that is generally offered to get people to sign on. And of course, the administration appears absolutely allergic to anything that might involve even incrementally better access to the American market for other countries because of the political firestorm that they anticipate from it. So, I think it's designed to fill the big gap that was left when former President Trump pulled the U.S. out of the Trans-Pacific Partnership and sort of ceded the terrain to the Chinese in some ways. Now the Chinese have made, a move of some degree of seriousness to talk about getting into that agreement. But my impression is that IPEF requires some beefing up before it's really going to be able to do the job.
Thanks, David. Anna, I apologize. Yeah, did you want to say something of the climate stuff or the IPEF?
Oh no, I forgot to mute. But I guess on IPEF, I could add. It will be really interesting to see if the administration can accomplish some of these goals, get countries like Malaysia and Indonesia to accept meaningfully higher labor standards without the promise of market access. So that will be really interesting to see. It's also kind of, the structure of it is kind of interesting. The fact that there are 4 pillars and that it has allowed India, for example, to bow out of the trade pillar. A lot of people, some people maybe saw that as a shortcoming, but the administration has talked about it kind of as a feature rather than a bug, that, the trade pillar can progress without the typical gripes of India, but India can be a constructive member in other places. So, maybe it is a shift toward this new world that we're thinking about with, more kind of plurilateral agreements where countries just kind of get together where they can and leave everything else to the side. But I think there's a lot of questions right now about the efficacy of IPEF. And I'll go ahead and now, so you know.
Thanks. Question from a listener about USMCA's panel ruling against a tight U.S. interpretation of rules of origin for automobiles. One of the most important supply chain relationships in America, obviously, is cars, basically on the U.S.-Canada border, and then now with Mexico, where supply chains can go back and forth across borders and generating a lot of trade in numbers, at least. David, any insight on whether the Biden administration will accept or reject the panel recommendation?
I'm sorry. I'm going to say no. That I have no insight because I've been looking at other things. I haven't reported on that at all, and I'll defer to one of my colleagues.
Gotcha. Anna, do you have any insight on that?
I can't say definitively. I don't know the definitive answer to that question. I think it's clear that they gave a far less kind of combative response to that ruling than they did to the WTO rulings. So after the U.S. came out really strongly against the WTO panel decisions regarding those national security issues and treating Hong Kong as part of China, there was a lot of speculation about whether the Biden administration would adopt a similar attitude toward USMCA. It's clear that they see those agreements quite differently. USMCA is really kind of Catherine Tai's baby to some respect, right? And I think there's a lot of progressive support for USMCA. I think the question right now is whether we'll see the U.S. abide by that ruling, or will we see the United States try to negotiate in the background with Canada and Mexico, given some of these other disagreements that are going on in the background as well, like Mexican energy, Mexican GMO corn, the U.S.-Canada dairy standoff. Maybe there's some kind of deal to be made there, or will we just see the United States adopt that panel decision?
Thanks, Anna. Thanks to all of you. I'm going to turn it back over to Ken now, who's going to take us home.
Well, thanks, John, and thanks, Bryce, David, and Anna. A really great conversation, hopscotching the globe. I'm coming on, don't usually do it this way, but doing it this way this time because it was a really cool question from my friend Brian Riley, the National Taxpayers Union. He said, you all do great work covering trade policy. Was it a career goal, or did some editor force it on you? And we're particularly interested because with our WITA Academy, one of the things we're doing is inviting people from our trade community on to talk about their career pathway in trade, how they got where they got today. Because a lot of us, it wasn't where we may have thought where we started from, and we sort of ended up here, and we kind of love it because we love our community. But start with you, Bryce. How did you get where you are now, how did you get there? And then come around to Anna, David, and John, I want to ask you as well.
Sure. I grew up in Washington, so I was always kind of listening to the policy circles. My first job in journalism was covering telecom, the Federal Communications Commission in Washington. And I think in terms of my career path, I always like to cover really kind of technical, weedy, nerdy issues, and trade definitely falls in that wheelhouse. In terms of getting here to Geneva, I just always wanted to live abroad, and an opportunity popped up, and I said yes.
Did you study journalism in college?
I did. I did some postgraduate work at the University of Georgetown in journalism.
Cool. Anna, how about you? How did you get to that purchase? Yeah, I'll tell you what, little secret. When I was in college, I think my dream was to be a columnist in the Russell Baker mold at the New York Times. Never made it there, but how did you land up? I guess it used to be known as the Gray Lady, right?
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, I had kind of a winding path that, you can make sense, make sense in retrospect, but, it was just really an example of one thing leading to another. I actually studied cultural anthropology undergrad and then had no idea what to do with that, and ended up going to China, ended up staying in China for 8 years and studying the language. And since I loved writing, working in a reporting role, when I came back to the United States, I went to SAIS and studied international econ. And so I kind of fell into the path where, econ plus China equals trade. But I love the beat. I was just thinking that in the midst of the Trump trade wars, everyone would say, oh, what a great time to be a trade reporter. You guys are always on page one. I actually think it's an even more fascinating time to be a trade reporter right now, given the big changes we're seeing in supply chains with the Russian war, the big turn in the United States to industrial policy, semiconductor restrictions, decoupling. I just think it's a fascinating time to be writing about all these issues. So
awesome. David, how about you?
Well, Ken, when I began my career on a manual typewriter, no lie, many moons ago, I actually wanted to be one of the so-called boys on the bus. I wanted to be a political reporter covering campaigns. But for various reasons, including how ridiculous our politics have become, I decided to do other things. I covered the Pentagon, the defense industry for a number of years. So like Bryce, I was very into detailed and arcane areas of policy. And then, when I went abroad in '97 to open a bureau in London for USA Today and then Beijing a few years later, being abroad, I always felt the international economic story got short shrift to many more mainstream or general areas of coverage. And then when I moved back to the States, doing trade, covering trade or global economics was a way to, frankly, have an excuse to get some foreign trips still, and to cover an area that blended together a lot of really interesting dimensions of high politics, other countries and cultures, various industries. It's really quite a wide remit.
Absolutely. As I personally, when I worked in government in the 90s, got to take some very interesting trips in those days as well. And John, not to leave you out of this, I'll actually pull you in on this to wrap us up. You started as a journalist. I think you've had a stint in Geneva as well. And you're writing a book right now, which I'm just fascinated about, by having nothing to do with trade at all, but about the iconic Earl Weaver, the former manager of the Baltimore Orioles. Just tell us about your path, and maybe just to drop a little nugget about the book, if you would.
Thanks. And thanks for having me again today. I grew up in Belgium, where my parents fled the terror of the Ford administration. I'm a French-speaking Belgian in part. And that the trade job was the job that the Wall Street Journal Bureau had available when I was in my 20s looking for work. So it's kind of fell into it. But I love it because it connects the world. And I covered WTO in Geneva too. Moved to Pittsburgh to cover global mining. And then when I left the Wall Street Journal, it was to make a film about a small town in West Virginia rocked by global trade. The movie's called Moundsville. It's on PBS. And so I work for Trade and Monitor and do projects. My new project is this baseball book, which is about the role of the manager, who used to be this iconic American archetype hero in the 70s, very colorful, Billy Martin, Tommy Lasorda, Earl Weaver, and now is kind of a boring civil servant functionary. And so it's about the evolution of that role and the life of this very funny, colorful man who can YouTube said terrible things to umpires, but a lot of fun. And it's going to be out Simon & Schuster, beginning of 2025. My first book. I'm very excited, very nervous.
Well, John's been filling me in as the journey of getting his book publisher and getting this started. I'm really excited to read that book when it comes out, John. Thank you all very, very much. Really appreciate the conversation. There were a ton of questions asked. John weaved a ton of those in, but there were others he didn't get to. Some of them embedded a lot of interesting ideas. So we're going to forward those to our discussants, so they'll be able to read those offline as well. They saw them as they popped in as well. So thanks to all of you for taking part. Thanks for joining us online. Looking forward to seeing people again in person at some of our events in the coming months. Thanks again to John, Bryce, David, and Anna. Thanks so much, everybody. Take care. Be well.